in February or March, when, because he just lives down the street next to what was the old, his office is there, the old Sacred Heart Catholic Church anyway. But Michael is a therapist and always has wonderful things to say to us. I have a very good friend that I have lunch with every Tuesday, and she's retired now, she's a psychologist. And it's just so interesting for me. She obviously never talks about her patients and everything, but to get some insight from her in terms of how she's,
I don't know which one of us that
how
is.
she is able to help people. And from what I heard, thank you so much for what you do, but also thank you for being with us today.
Yeah.
At Hanson.
Thank you. Well, it is nice to be with all of you, and I don't know, Jim, maybe the mic's just a little hot. I don't know. I'm not sure I have a volume control on mine, so. The other mic is off, so yeah. All right, well, I told them I would project anyway, so we'll work on that. Thankfully, this is not a cavernous building. So I wanted to talk today about trauma responses, and there's a lot of conversation in popular culture, as well as in the clinical and scholarly community, about trauma. Interesting that right after World War I, what we know today as trauma was being described as shell shock. And so if you think about that as one of the ways in which our modern minds have been trying to engage, understand, unravel, and bring healing to the experience of trauma, the field of trauma is really still very, very young. One of the books that had a huge impact on the conversation by Bessel van der Kolk, maybe some of you have ever heard of this book, The Body Keeps the Score. And what van der Kolk is exploring is the impact of trauma on our physical bodies as well as the emotional. Talks about something called implicit memory as well as explicit memory. So explicit memory are these memories we have that we can actually articulate. And when it comes to trauma, being able to talk about our memories is one of the most important steps in moving towards healing. But unfortunately, and I think van der Kolk's book talks about this, but there's a lot written on the fracturing that happens during a traumatic experience. So the fracturing that happens even on a neurological level, fracturing meaning it is hard when a person endures a traumatic experience for that person to actually be able to narrate back the entire experience, because the memory is encoded in fragments. And even to cope with the impact of experiences that we don't know how to consolidate, we don't know how to explain, experiences that cause us to lose some part of ourselves, that can be so severe, of course, that we just shunt them off and they are not a part of our conscious awareness or conscious life. And that's perhaps more of the relevance, that when we can't remember, some part of us is remembering, a part of us that can't articulate the harm that we're still carrying with us. What I believe, and my colleagues, and Renee, thank you for coming. She's one of my colleagues at New Day, and Melissa is also another colleague at New Day, and Melissa actually has a home office through New Day just at the end of the block. So she's one direction. My home office is half a block down 7th. You'll see me there. And then Renee is in her home office just north of town. Is it Albert Drive that you're the opposite way from? Okay, so we're good on 8th. So, and you can look us up, newdayresource.com, and we've got cards and contact information in the back if you'd like to talk a little bit more or explore your own story. And that is part of what I do hope that we can reflect on here, is how do we approach our own stories where we're carrying harm, and how can we bring and invite healing into those places? Of course, it's hard to invite healing into places we can't even articulate, places we're not even aware need healing. And that's where I wanted to focus our talk today. And just so we have enough time to, I'm going to put my little timer on so that we'll have time for questions and answers. But we can start by acknowledging that trauma and the evidence of trauma sometimes takes us by surprise. But the good news is, if we know how to interpret what's happening, it can be a doorway that we can then begin to walk further down. So Albert, if you'd be willing to play our video clip. I thought of this clip as I thought about coming today.
Carl felt my first show should be today. Carl felt my first show should be today I will own my panic, since it would be very in the now. But I thought I had a better idea. Hello, I'm Stuart Smalley, and I am so delighted to be here. And for my first show, I've decided to demonstrate just how powerful a tool the daily affirmation can be. You see, all my life, I've heard the same things over and over again. Stuart, you're not good enough. Stuart, you're not smart enough. Oh, and by the way, Stuart, no one likes you. You know who was saying all these horrible things? My mom? Well, yeah. My dad? Well, him too. But mainly, these words were coming from me. That's right, the little Stuart that sits inside my brain criticizing every little thing I do. Well, today, to show how the daily affirmation works, I've invited someone who has even less self-esteem than I do, if you can believe that. We'll call her Mia C. to protect her anonymity. And Mia, first of all, I want to thank you for doing this. I know how much courage it took. Mia, can you hear me?
Yes. I'm sorry.
You look a little nervous, Mia. Maybe try to relax a little.
Sorry.
Well, maybe if you just unclenched your body. Your whole body looks a little tight. Take a cleansing, big cleansing breath. Good. Very, very good. Now, Mia, I want you to look in this mirror. Don't look at me. Only you can help you. That's it. Look in the mirror. Well, see how pretty you are? Okay, let's take those glasses off. Oh, good. Okay, let's put the glasses back on. You look very pretty with the glasses.
Sorry, thank you.
Mia, have you ever noticed that you apologize a lot?
Oh, I'm sorry, do I?
Yes, you do. No, that's exactly the point. You see, I want you to look in that mirror, Mia, and I want you to repeat after me. I am a worthy human being.
I'm a worthy human being.
Okay, I really couldn't hear you. Try it again.
Oh, okay. I'm a worthy human being?
No, Mia, it's not a question. Try it again.
I'm sorry, what is the second part?
Worthy human being. I am a worthy human being. Just say it.
Am I saying it to you or to myself?
Just say it. I am a worthy human being.
I'm a worthy human being.
Okay, not louder.
I am a worthy human being.
Okay, mean it.
I am a worthy human being.
Believe it.
I hate you, Mom! Sorry.
No, that was interesting. That was actually good. I think we're getting somewhere. You think your mom might be watching?
She's dead.
Oh, good.
Pretty typical therapy session. Well, did you see in Mia C some trauma symptomology? Is it trauma she can articulate? Only by accident. But as she pressed in, she was able to articulate the start of some of the genesis of that trauma. And her story is not unlike our story. And when I talk about trauma responses as a roadmap, that's what I'm talking about, is paying attention to our reactivity in circumstances, situations, relationships. Even before she was able to articulate that her mother was the source of some of her trauma, you could see it in how she held herself. Stuart acknowledged or observed her apologies. Like, all of these symptoms are tells that trauma is being carried, trauma is at work, and trauma is, for this woman, though we can laugh a little bit at it, there's many, many, many of us who are chained to our trauma responses, and they limit how we operate in relationships, in the world, what we hope for, what we dream for, what we protect ourselves from. Trauma can really capture our ability to self-activate, self-actualize, to become what is possible for us. So trauma is a huge limiting factor. Jim rightly pointed out that my font size was regrettably small, so not even I can read it. So I'll just, from over there, so I'll come over here and read it for you. So dysregulation, and this is signs of dysregulation, and that's a big piece of understanding and approaching trauma responses, is understanding that rather than hating our dysregulation, we can actually start moving towards it, not because we need to clean it up, though acting out in unregrettable ways relationally, emotionally, and those kinds of things is something that we would usually aspire to do less of. But to white knuckle through those moments where we're just essentially biting our tongue or holding onto the steering wheel, white knuckling through a moment where we're dysregulated, that's not really engaging trauma. It's simply trying to keep the lid on a little bit tighter. And we can get through those moments. But what I'm hoping after our talk today is, if you're aware of some of these kinds of experiences that are occurring in your committed relationships, or out in the world, or even intrapsychically, as Stuart Smalley talked about the little Stuart that sits inside of his head. The fancy word for that are introjects. These people, these tapes that start playing in our heads and our hearts, that were often these tracks or tapes were laid down in our formative years of development. And they're really hard to push back on, especially in the echo chamber of kind of our own heart and mind, which is, again, another reason why I love what I do, because it is an invitation to get out of that echo chamber and invite someone else into that space, your interior world. So just some of the signs of emotional dysregulation: severe depression, anxiety, high levels of shame and anger, self-harm, excessive substance use, high-risk sexual behaviors, extreme perfectionism, which might be redundant, highly conflictual interpersonal relationships, disordered eating, suicidal thoughts or attempts. And one of the things that this chart is trying to communicate is what's known as an arousal response, and that's not sexual arousal. Psychologically, arousal is the description of parts of us that wake up. So a slap across the face is arousing, not sexually, but it certainly awakes the systems of responses in your body. Aromas, wonderful apple pie at Thanksgiving is very arousing in the sense that it is waking up your ability to respond and perceive. So affect regulation on this scale has to do with the level of arousal, and the sweet spot in this illustration here in the middle, your emotions are relaxed excitement and sensations are calm, alert, aware, and attentive. Another way to talk about this from a brain state is that your frontal lobe, your executive state, is the part of your brain that you have the most access to. When you're in that regulated state, you're really able to function really well. Once you become triggered to the point where you lose your ability to self-regulate, and your brain will actually start changing the part of the brain that it's using to engage and respond to your world. So your executive state starts to shut down and your emotional centers start to light up, And if the arousal is significant enough, even the emotional centers of the brain will give way to the fight, flight, freeze, submit response. And so in the fight, flight, freeze response, from what we know now, that's about as far away from your executive state as you can get. So people who are significantly dysregulated, the way to help them into a different brain state is not through lecturing or laying down the law. Your emotional intensity tends to push them farther into that state. So this is obviously relevant for all of us, but certainly for parents, because it's hard when your little one is dysregulated and it's time to go to bed and you just want to be done with your parenting job. It's hard many times for parents to stay regulated in that state. Just put your PJs on, stop running around, get your teeth brushed, right? That response is understandable, probably ubiquitous. But for the child experiencing a giant grown-up, that's going to be an inhibitor for staying in their executive state, isn't it? So just understanding that this arousal and how it interacts with our trauma responses, to me, is essential to understanding our responses. So many times for the hyperarousal, this is hyper, that's hypo, hyperarousal, panic, terror, rage, racing heart, faster breathing, tightening in the chest, stomach jitteriness, we tend to associate that with dysregulated, when you're loud, when things are getting thrown, when profanity is flying, when you're sobbing or crying, like that kind of experience we think of as dysregulated. And while it is, what I appreciate about this particular illustration is you can be just as dysregulated in a hypo-aroused state. And that is, you're dysregulated, it's just that you're withdrawing or disappearing or kind of shrinking. So shame, hopelessness, and despair are strong emotions in a hypo-aroused state, and numbness, being shut down, shallow breathing, difficulty concentrating, even feeling sleepy. So I think it's helpful to recognize that if you're not one to kind of lose yourself and fly off the handle and hit the ceiling, all those things, that doesn't mean that you're regulated necessarily. Finding that you have less words, finding that you're starting to spin into some self-contempt, shame, or just starting to shut down, that's going to be really important data for how to recognize the impact, not just of hyperarousal, but then to begin to ask yourself, what is this connected to in my story? How does this moment of hypo or hyperarousal help me see where I can start pressing in to my story to bring healing? So the very first piece, I think, of this experience is using, I'll just go backwards if I can. Okay, I guess I can't go back. Too bad for me. Maybe, Albert, you can help just pause the, can you help me? Can you pause the, yeah, there we go. Thank you. Very good. So in moving from arousal and our responses to trauma to the pathway of healing, I developed this. This is something that I use with some of my clients at New Day, just to help conceptualize the mechanics of how trauma, harm relate to shame, contempt, and then our style of relating. And we can go to the next slide now. Thank you. He knows what he's doing. Very good. Okay, so with these concentric circles, what I'm trying to identify, doggone it. Sorry, gang. We might just have to look at it through this, don't we? So core needs, and I think these come online, and I talked about this in my last visit a year ago, is that core needs, I think, come online at birth, and I think they stay active throughout the entire lifespan. I think we're all asking the question every day in just about every experience. One, am I safe? Am I safe physically in my environment? Am I safe relationally in my environment? Am I safe emotionally in my environment? I think each of us is asking that throughout our entire lifespan, and we're always assessing and trying to come up, obviously, with a positive, validated, yes, I am safe. And, oops, let's go, there we go. But two more, am I significant? That is, do I matter? Is there a point for me being here? Do I have anything to contribute? And am I lovable? Do those that I need me? Do those that I love me? Am I someone worth pursuing? And those are more existential questions. I just think they reside in the human heart, and I think they're pinging in all of our relationships. And you can perhaps just see that in any committed relationship, our experiences from day to day with that person or persons are going to be touching on these experiences. And a good day with your partner, my guess is that these three are being affirmed and validated. A bad day, they're being invalidated. And that, maybe you could go to our next slide. And that's where harm happens. So harm in this illustration happens anytime one or more of those three core needs are invalidated. When you're not safe, when you don't matter, when you're not lovable. And maybe all of us know the story of the child who's on the playground in grade school. Everyone's lining up to be picked for teams, and you're the last one picked, right? And not just are you the last one picked, they're fighting over which team has to have you, right? That would be a childhood example of where those three core needs are all being invalidated. And it can be a powerful developmental experience for a child who experiences, I'm not safe. Why am I not safe? Well, because in my peer group, I'm being humiliated. I'm not safe. And obviously, I don't have what it takes. They're fighting over who has to take me. And nobody wants me. So just a simple example of how one experience now can trigger an experience of harm. Just think about that experience being repeated for kids who've been bullied, for kids who go home and are bullied at home. And that becomes a normative experience as their self-concept is developing. That's where we get some of this ingrained trauma responses because of all of the harm that occurs. And I don't know that this is sort of my clinical definition. I don't know if it's reflected in the literature, but I see, for my purposes, that one-off harm always causes damage. There's never a time when having these three core needs invalidated doesn't harm you. It always harms you. But if you're the last one picked one day and you come back and the next day you're the first one picked, that can mitigate some of the impact of that harm. But chronic harm, I think, is another way of talking about abuse. And then when you do have experiences where all three of these are violated, I think that could be one of the ways that we think about trauma, where your entire core need is invalidated. And I think you could probably see that in combat zones. You could see that as people who are victims of violent assault. You can see that in people who are being verbally and emotionally abused. I think we can see that those very likely could be part of what we call trauma. Next slide. What I argue is that anytime there's an experience of harm, there's an automatic next step that happens psychologically, and that is shame. And there's a lot being written these days about shame, but shame's been something that's been talked about for a long time. Jessica, what's the most recent book that Brene Brown wrote that you're reading? Do you remember the title of that book? Okay. She's talking about shame and how that impacts Atlas of the Heart. Yeah, she has. I mean, that's her thing, right? So if you don't know Brene Brown, if you YouTube her, she's got lots of TED Talks and she's very engaging and she has a lot of titles that she's written, but she's a researcher on shame. So anyway, all that to say, there's a lot of talk about shame these days. And for the purposes of trauma, one of the things that I think gets embedded in a self-concept is shame when harm happens. And what shame says is you were harmed because you weren't enough. You weren't strong enough. You weren't smart enough. You weren't lovable enough. And there's some part of us that just agrees with that message to try to bring meaning to the harm. And I don't know why this is so instinctive, but I do find that for so many people that I work with, this is ubiquitous. However, it's not conscious, and it's hard for a person to articulate the shame agreement that comes out of a harmful or traumatic experience. So the shame agreement comes after a lot of work. We can even identify the harm without being able to connect the dots to what the shame agreement is. So the shame agreements often remain elusive, and I think that is a lot of the work that you find yourself doing with a therapist or a trusted friend. You can go to the next slide. So because shame happens right away, the next step that I think is also instinctive is something called contempt. And that is the promise to the self that I will be enough. I wasn't enough in that story, in that marriage, in that relationship. I should never have taken the drink from that guy in the bar, but I will never trust again, or I will never be weak again, or I will always be someone who is magnanimous or draws people to themselves. These contempt agreements are wedded to shame agreements, but we usually, like I said, we don't see the shame agreement. What we can begin to discern is where the contempt comes in. That's a little easier to see. And unfortunately, contempt not only agrees with shame, it also has no mercy, no generosity, no kindness, no gentleness. Contempt is merit-based. You have to earn approval. You have to earn validation. So contempt has a really hard edge, and it is merciless. And in that way, it actually takes life. It doesn't give life. Contempt is not a nurturing experience, a life-taking experience. And next slide. The last layer that I talk about is the style of relating. And the goal of a style of relating, which right around here are strategies we develop, usually early, that we refine over time, strategies that make relationships and experiences safe. Safe meaning that the three core needs are either obscured in whatever style of relating we've developed, we're not going near those things, or we've developed strategies that we believe will help us validate those three core needs. Unfortunately, it's rooted in contempt, and contempt is not actually a nurturing, healing experience. And our style of relating, when it's rooted in contempt, can't do anything but continue to actually reharm us. Another talk I'd love to give is on the concept of trauma bonding, and that's a complex concept, but it's related to how we make sense of the trauma and our experiences and how we try to resolve or bring healing to those traumatic experiences. And style of relating is one of the ways that we try to resolve or bring healing to the experiences where we felt unsafe, like we didn't matter, like we're not lovable enough. So that's the basic rubric of how I approach starting to put words to our trauma responses and the stories that gave rise to them. But we're starting in those concentric rings, usually at the outer ring, and we're moving towards the center. For some people who have severe traumatic experiences, even the stories of harm are obscure. It's hard. And from what we're learning, when you do have a recollection of a severely traumatic experience, it even is fragmented and fractured. So our ability to even talk about the entire story is compromised. And for many of us, some of those severely traumatic experiences also happened when we were in our childhood years. That is, we're remembering the experience through the eyes of a child. And the child continues to narrate the meaning of that experience into our adult lives. And that also is a profoundly limiting experience, because children, how they operate in their world, it's very different than how we operate in our world. And children are often very, very egocentric, but it's developmentally appropriate. So for instance, one quick story, and I'll end with this. In one of the group counseling sessions that I was a part of, there was a man who talked to the group about an experience in his childhood where he was 6 years old, and his parents on a Sunday afternoon were having their friends over, and they had cocktails in the backyard. And Dad said, "Watch after your brother." Okay, so the 6-year-old is watching his 4-year-old brother. Parents are home. Well, the little 4-year-old walks over on this summer day in the garage over to a metal folding chair, sees a mason jar full of water, and takes a swig, and immediately starts screaming. And the older brother, who's telling the story, is terrified at what's happening, doesn't know how to understand it, and runs to the backyard to tell his dad that something's wrong. So the parents come in, and the father immediately knows what happened. He had the lawnmower battery out. It was sulfuric acid. When his friends came over, he just got distracted by cocktails. But the aftermath was not that the parents took responsibility. They said, "How could you have let this happen?" to the man who's telling the story. And to the day of the telling of the story, he still believed he was responsible to keep his little brother safe, and that his inability to keep his brother safe was on him. A 6-year-old was narrating the meaning of the trauma decades later. And it took him being able to hear the responses of the group for him to begin to realize, oh, wait, yeah, maybe that wasn't my job. Maybe this shame isn't mine to own. I grieve what happened to my brother, but maybe I don't have to own that as my responsibility. That was his path towards healing in that story. So just to acknowledge that for us, our trauma responses will keep following us. And if we keep them at bay and pretend not to see them, we will miss opportunities to begin to bring healing into our stories. So, thanks for your attention. And we have time, I hope, for some questions. Bathrooms are up the stairs.
Thank you for a really excellent talk and insight that I think we can all use no matter what major or mild trauma that we go day to day. One of the things that brought to mind is this, as a medical provider, and daily I see or observe other people reacting to a situation. I think, okay, we need to kind of simmer down. The patients can hear us and all this stuff in the discussion. But I think it's a response to that trauma of seeing something go south, or worry that you're going to be shamed because you made a mistake or you didn't pick up something. And that happened to me the other day. I gave a written order that didn't go through on our electronic record, and I gave a verbal order on a piece of paper that was not the same, and we gave the wrong injection. And it's like, you know, so there's always this, it's just perpetuated in the demand for perfection.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for that. We've got one. Okay.
Thank you for what you've done for us today. Is it when one has trauma, does it follow you throughout your life? If that, when it does that mean that there was not enough healing? Can it be resurrected? I mean, everything's going fine, let's say, for the individual, and can it be resurrected like when someone maybe says something and it comes back?
Yep. And I think maybe some of us have actually lived that experience where something happens decades later that resurrects a memory, or we start unraveling emotionally or psychologically in a way that we can't explain. Yes, so that happens all the time. And it's an invitation for us to become curious, not about our deficiency, but about where is there healing that could yet still be invited. So many of us look at trauma responses as a de facto judgment against us and our insufficiency, our, you're always losing your cool, those kinds of things. We're critical, self-critical when we're not placid or relaxed, and that's just a missed opportunity. Good question.
Thank you. And then one last one. Can self-confidence be forever destroyed?
It can when the shame agreement remains unexamined.
Okay.
A couple of questions, and one ties right into her question in that, can we ever then reach a level where we have all of those resolved? Or is that indicative in like someone like the Dalai Lama, who seems to have, but is that end game or end goal? Sure. And is it really achievable for the average person?
Right, great question. Yeah. Can we get to nirvana? I don't want to knock the Dalai Lama, but if I had minders around my entire life, I might find being placid might be easier. But so just think, and I don't want to trigger anyone, but if you can imagine losing a child, in the immediate aftermath, the intensity of the loss is overwhelming, and you lose your way. And 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, the crushing grief isn't manifested the same way. You're actually able to put your shoes on. You're actually able to remember what you're supposed to do that day. You're able to go through your life in a way that's not as disrupted as it was in the aftermath of the loss. But there will never be a day when it's okay. And you'll always be grieving what could have been. And I think that's analogous to what we're talking about. That for some people, the trauma response is so unexplored and in that way new, that they can't even approach the story without eliciting a lot of flashbacks, unwanted memories, heart palpitations, panic responses. There are stories people cannot approach. So one of my colleagues, Melissa, she does EMDR. And one of the really important components is that she helps people start to abate those panic responses through that modality of EMDR. So once you get the trauma symptomology under control, that's great, but it doesn't resolve the shame agreement or the story. It just was a barrier to processing the story. So then once we can manage the trauma response, now we can start moving into the impact of the story and why it has been so difficult to integrate. But, I think we do often wish, when can I be done with it? Like, when is it over? And do I have to be a mess the whole time? And I think that's a beautiful longing, and I think we can become more and more whole. But I think in most trauma, I think therapists also would agree, the goal of trauma is actually to start consolidating and integrating the pieces and the stories into a whole concept, self-concept, that we can explain the meaning of the experience. If you think about somebody, for instance, who has dissociative identity disorder, we used to call it multiple personality disorder. One of the modalities of helping a person resolve those trauma symptoms is to begin to identify the separate personalities and begin to integrate them into one concept of the self. But most people who have that experience of being dissociative in that way, they still acknowledge these separate parts are with me. I don't know if you saw Beautiful Mind, but how those vestiges of those hallucinations, one of the scenes as he's teaching as an older man, and they're stalking him on his way to his classroom. And he acknowledges, I can't talk to him because if I do, stuff starts to unravel. But they're right here in his peripheral vision. And I feel like trauma and the response of trauma has something to do with how do we live in the tension of acknowledging that there are pieces still there. But he was able to go throughout the rest of his life and have a really rewarding experience. So I think the more you press into healing, the more integrated you can become. And that makes you more resilient. So
My other comment was that it's interesting that trauma seems to have a greater effect than, say, joy
sure does.
or huge positive experience. And that's just an interesting observation about us as human beings.
Yes, it's coded in a different part of the brain. It's really intriguing that those bad memories have a longevity and an impact.
Could you just repeat the name of that first book that you held up?
Yep.
Thank you.
Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, and I'll have it with me if you want to look at that.
Do you think there's reason to believe that having experienced trauma or even just some difficulty helps one develop compassion for others? And if so, can that compassion be used in the healing process? I mean, if you're helping other people deal with their trauma, is that helpful to your own healing?
Absolutely. I think you can't find a therapist who doesn't have their own story that drove them into that line of work. Some of the therapists, if you've met with them, have done a better job than others of resolving some of those issues. I sat with a therapist once and I wondered, which one of us is the patient?
But then the second part of my question is, someone who's had been fortunate, really fortunate in their life and has not had difficulty, is it harder to develop compassion, or is compassion just something you're born with?
Right. I think that the ability to be compassionate has to do with how you deal with your shame agreements. So someone who doesn't have compassion, I would expect to look for that style of relating and the contempt that came out of that. If you're hard and you just won't let things affect you, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, God helps those who help themselves, all of that unempathetic response, I see that as all guarded, defended behavior. So to me, that's a tell of trauma right there. I think we've even had presidents like that.
I think, I want to thank you. I think bringing this to our attention will be great for all of us to not only understand ourselves and what we're doing, but in dealing with people that we might identify as difficult, with a little more compassion, as Jenny mentioned. And I think this was a very spiritual presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. And Kathy, to that point, the more and more we recognize trauma symptomology in someone we're interacting with, we can remind ourselves, this isn't about me. The more we can tell ourselves that, the better.
Just a quick thing. Is there a way, do people cope with trauma? And I'm not talking like huge, major trauma,
Capital T.
By tapping into the positive of everything and really being able to move things to a positive spin on things always, and tapping into joy as much as possible.
Are you asking, is that a coping mechanism
is that a
for
coping?
trauma?
Is that a healthy coping mechanism? Is it?
Well, the answer would be yes and no. I mean, basically, mental health issues are only a problem if they're a problem for you. So are you functional with that perspective and coping mechanism? Then maybe it's not a problem. But I might, as a therapist, I might say, it seems like that's representing a locked door around a place you're not willing to go. Why is the door so locked? Why can't we approach some of those harder, more difficult questions, experiences? Why do we always have to look on the bright side? That the answer is in their story. Good question.
Not again, thank you so much.